Now that we talked about computers, laptops, and mobile devices, let's move into another important group of endpoint devices: printers, IP phones, and servers. These devices may not all look like the kinds of devices people carry around every day, but they are still very important on the network. Why? Because they're still using the network for a real purpose. A printer receives jobs, an IP phone sends and receives voice traffic. A server provides services, files, or applications to other devices. So, in this lesson, we're going to look at how these shared and specialized devices fit into the bigger networking picture. One of the biggest beginner lessons in networking is this: not every endpoint looks like a laptop or a phone. Some endpoints are built for general purpose use, like a computer. Others are built for a more specific job. That is where printers, IP phones, and servers come in. They're still endpoint devices, but their role is usually more specialized. So instead of thinking an endpoint must be a computer, it helps to think this way. An endpoint is any device that uses the network to send, receive, or provide something useful. That one idea helps a lot. Let's start with printers. A printer may not feel like a computer in the usual everyday sense, but on a network, it still behaves like an endpoint. Why? Because it receives data from another device across the network. For example, when you print a document from your laptop, the printer becomes the destination for that communication. The network carries the print job from your device to the printer. The printer then processes that information and turns it into output on paper. So the printer is not just sitting there passively, it is actually participating in communication. That makes it an endpoint. Printers are a great example of a shared network device. Instead of every user needing their own separate printer cable, multiple users can send print jobs across the network to the same printer. That makes the printer a shared resource. In a small office, several people may all print to one network printer. In a larger office, different departments might share different printers. So a printer is important not just because it is connected, but because it is often a common destination for user traffic. This is one of the ways a network becomes useful. It lets many devices reach shared resources. Now let's talk about IP phones. The CCST blueprint specifically includes IP phone as one of the endpoint categories students should know. An IP phone is a phone that uses the IP network to carry voice communications. In other words, instead of using a separate traditional analog phone line, it uses the data network. That means the phone is sending and receiving network traffic. It is not just passing traffic along for other devices the way a switch would. It is directly participating in communication. That makes it an endpoint. So, from a networking point of view, an IP phone is not less of a network device than a computer. It is just more specialized endpoint. What makes an IP phone interesting is that it shows how networks are not only for files, websites, and apps. Networks can also carry voice. That means when someone places a call on an IP phone, the network is being used to support real time communication. So, an IP phone is doing things like sending voice traffic, receiving voice traffic, connecting to call control services, depending on the network to stay connected. This is a good reminder that the network supports many kinds of services, not just web browsing or email. Sometimes it supports voice, sometimes it supports printing, sometimes it supports file access, sometimes it supports all of them at the same time. Now let's move to servers. Beginners sometimes think a server is some completely different kind of thing that should not be grouped with endpoint devices. But from a networking point of view, a server is still an endpoint. Why? Because it still sends and receives data across the network. The difference is usually in its role. A laptop may request a web page. A server may send that web page back. A user may request a file. A server may store that file and provide it. A printer may receive a print job. A server may host a print service behind the scenes. So a server is still participating in communication. It is just often the endpoint that provides something to other endpoints. This is the easiest way to think about servers. Clients request, servers respond. Now, that is a simplified view, but it is a very useful beginner view. A server may provide files, websites, email, databases, authentication, or other shared services. Modern web services often depend on multiple kinds of servers, such as web servers, back-end servers, and database services working together over a network. So a server is absolutely part of the network communication. It is not just in the background. It is one of the actual devices doing the work of providing services across the network. So now let's put these three together. A printer often receives shared print jobs. An IP phone handles voice communication. A server provides services and resources. These devices do different jobs, but all three are examples of specialized network connected equipment. That is the important theme in this lesson. They may not all look alike, they may not all be used the same way, but they all use the network in meaningful ways. So the network is not just connecting people to the internet, it is connecting users to shared resources, voice services, and application services too. Let's make this practical. Imagine a small office. One employee prints a report to the shared printer. Another employee is on a call using an IP phone. At the same time, a server in the back room stores shared files and maybe supports email or business apps. What is happening on the network? Different types of traffic are moving for different purposes. The printer is receiving a print job. The IP phone is carrying voice traffic. The server is sending and receiving data for shared services. Different job, different traffic, different purpose. But the same big networking idea applies. All of those are endpoint devices using the network. This is also a good place to compare these devices with infrastructure. A switch mainly forwards traffic. A router mainly moves traffic between networks. But a printer, IP phone, or server is not mainly there to move someone else's traffic along. Those devices are using the network directly. That is why they belong in the endpoint conversation. So if you ever feel unsure, ask yourself, is this device mainly moving traffic for others, or is it directly using the network for its own job? That question usually clears things up. This matters for your CCST studies because the blueprint specifically expects you to recognize IP phones, printers, and servers as endpoint device categories under Objective 3.3. So, this lesson is not just about vocabulary. It is about learning how to recognize real network connected equipment and understand its role. That becomes useful later when you begin thinking about what kind of traffic a device generates, what service a device provides or consumes, how devices connect, and how to troubleshoot them. Because a printer problem, a phone problem, and a server problem may all show up differently on the network. So let's wrap this up. Printers, IP phones, and servers are all important endpoint devices. A printer is an endpoint because it receives and processes print jobs. An IP phone is an endpoint because it uses the IP network to send and receive voice traffic. A server is an endpoint because it sends and receives data while providing services to other devices. They are different from one another. They are different from laptops and phones. They are different from switches and routers. But they all fit into the same big picture. They are specialized devices that use the network to do useful work. And that is the easiest way to remember this lesson. Shared device or specialized device, same basic idea. If it uses the network directly, it belongs in the endpoint conversation.